Now we're continuing on slide 7. So, okay, small technical problem. Slide 7. So China had become isolated, not from the Soviet Union, but certainly isolated from the rest of the world. And as such, because of the Korean War, certainly, but also because of U.S. hostility for other reasons, an embargo was instituted by the U.S. and was followed by most of the countries that were non-communist. In China, you could buy Cuban cigars during this period. You could get what do they make in Russia? They make wooden dolls that fit one inside the other. They made steel. They made airplanes, and so on. Which is an interesting point. They weren't exporting very much, and that meant that that their currency, the ruble, if there's not much you can buy from a country, then there's no point in having any of their money, is there? This is a basic point of foreign exchange. If a country makes a lot of things that are wanted all over the world, then having some of their money is a great idea. Therefore, there is demand for that money. Therefore, there's no reason to control its value. On the other hand, when a country doesn't make much of anything, then its money becomes the equivalent of pocket lint or toilet paper or something like that. I know I'm being unkind, but I'm telling you the truth. So during this whole period, the Russian ruble and the Chinese yuan, Y-U-A-N, or renminbi, were worth nothing on the world markets because they literally had very little that anybody wanted to buy. And that's why there was, one of the reasons anyway, why there was this gold trade going through Macau in and out of China, because the Chinese couldn't use their currency to buy anything. And to this day, even though the Chinese economy is much stronger than it ever has been, and its currency is stronger than it ever has been, its tradability on world markets is still limited because the government still controls its value. But that's a topic for another day. It's one of the things you hear about in the newspapers. So this idea of isolation from the West, I say a two-way street here. It's kind of a misnomer, but the idea is that just as much as the West wanted China isolated, so did Mao want China isolated from the West. He wanted to keep their influence out while he was completely changing the country into a socialist country. But it was necessary, going on to slide 8, to have some intercourse with Western countries and other non-communist countries. And for that purpose, the party had specialized offices and departments, such as the International Liaison Department, that took care of these contacts and made sure that when they happened in ways that were completely in line with the political objectives of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's why, for example, a special party office supervised everything that had to do with Hong Kong and Macau. The establishment, for example, of the Xinhua news agency, I guess I should put that on this slide somewhere. So I'm going to pretend like we're in lecture and I'm making we are in lecture, and I am making a change. But anyway, this Xinhua news agency It was a news agency, all right, but it was also in Hong Kong. The Xinhua News Agency was a de facto embassy or consulate of the PRC. But everybody who was assigned there was assigned under a very thinly veiled cover of being part of the PRC's news agency. And it was used, in a sense, to transmit news to the British. It was used to tell the British what the Beijing government wanted to know about the latest changes in policy. And it was also used to do that for Hong Kong people as well. So, as I say, this was very, very important to Mao and to the party to make sure that everything that was done regarding these sensitive windows to the world was done in accordance with policy goals of the Chinese Communist Party. So Mao regularly reviewed everything that went on. These activities were directly supervised by Zhou Enlai, and so on. You remember Liao Chengzhi. Liao Chengzhi was the son of Liao Zhongkai, the man who was assassinated in 1925 by the KMT right wing. He had two deputies in his office that dealt specifically with Hong Kong. They were both senior figures in CCP intelligence who wore multiple hats. They had intelligence duties which are not clearly defined as of today, but they also had this duty to work in this office, presumably to supervise information gathering activities. Let's go on then to slide 9. It became a priority during this period to bring capable Chinese people back to the motherland in order to help reconstruct the country. And there were thousands of them who decided to do that, who brought their families back. And this was done partly, I think it would have happened anyway, but it was also done, I suspect, in at least an imitation or the model had been used earlier in Russia. There's a very good film, since I always like to mention films, a French film that is very accurate, according to somebody I know who studies Russia, called East-West, or in French, Est-Ouest. And it had several big stars in it. I'm not good at keeping track of big star names. But how was that spelled? O-E-S-T, I think it's E-S-T-O-E-S-T, something like that. It's about a 15-year-old movie, but it tells the story of a ethnic Russian family living in France who decide to go back to Russia and all the hell they go through under Stalin. And sad to say, the same sort of problem existed for many of the people who went back to China. Now, I've picked 3 here who were fairly privileged individuals who were doing things that were quite critical, and so they were not messed with as the regime took its political twists and turns, particularly after 1957. None of these people suffered by being labeled as rightists or by being imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution. So this is the sweet end of the return to the motherland. But thousands of other people were who came back and filled lower level jobs that were not on the on the white list, so to speak, or the red list of people not to mess around with once the political campaigns really went crazy. So these 3 people played very key roles. I'm not going to read it all to you. You can read this for yourself, and you can find some amount of information on each one of these people on the web. You may have heard of the book, The Rape of Nanking, that was written by oh my goodness, I can't remember her name all of a sudden. Written by a young lady who unfortunately committed suicide. It's terrible. I can't remember her name. But anyway, you could figure this out on the web. She wrote 3 really good books. The Chinese in America is one of them, and The Rape of Nanking is another one. And the third one is about this man here, Chen Xuesun. It's called the Shadow of the something of the Silkworm. Darn, can't remember it. But her book on Chen Xuesun, which has the word silkworm in it, silkworm being a kind of Chinese missile, was a very good study of Chen, although she was writing sort of as his partisan. Chen went through a lot of grief. He had had a few associations with some members of the Communist Party in the 1940s when he was a professor at Caltech. First a graduate student under Theodore von Karman, the famous rocket scientist who was one of the fathers of our space program. And he went to Germany as a U.S. Army officer to interview and select German rocket scientists to come to the United States. And once the Mccarthy era picked up in the United States, I hope you've taken a little bit of U.S. history and you know what the Mccarthy era was. The virulent anti-communist period right after the Korean War, during and after the Korean War. Chen was identified as a communist sympathizer, even though he may not have been, but he was put through such hell that he decided to leave the United States for China, and the Americans decided to let him go. And off he went with a lot of publicity, sailed to China, went in through Hong Kong, and started designing missiles. A very intelligent immigration and emigration policy on our part, I have to say. Moving on to the next slide. The Sino-Soviet friendship period was extremely important to China. It lasted for 10 years, and China got a lot out of it. Not only were there grants and loans, but there were several thousand foreign experts, as they came to be called, who were sent to China to assist with key jobs, in other words, to do a massive technology and know-how transfer to China, as it was certainly in Russia's best interest to build up China as a capable ally so that there would be no threat from the East. However, this was not a perfect situation. There were slip-ups, there were aches and pains. For one thing, the Soviet experts lived apart from the Chinese for security reasons, because the Chinese did not want extensive contact between Soviet people and Chinese people. They wanted authorized contact, so there would be no interference with the party's program, even though it might have been unintentional. And so, and also, to tell you the truth, if you were somebody in the Soviet Union and you were told you were going to go to China to be an expert, and you're taking your wife and your kids with you, if you were to go there and live several rungs below in terms of standard of living where you were in the Soviet Union, you wouldn't be too thrilled. And so that meant that it was necessary to create special housing, which, and a very good example of that, if you ever go to Beijing, the Friendship Hotel still exists, and the Friendship Hotel was the biggest Soviet settlement of experts in China. And you can walk around there and look at the architecture and just imagine what it was like to be a Russian living in China in those days. This collaboration worked fairly well in many areas, and in some areas it didn't work so well that I've listed here. Going on to the next slide. The early political campaigns now were at the center of the party's program, and they were intended to secure society. Now, why were they necessary? The planners who initiated these campaigns believed they were necessary because there were so many elements in Chinese society left over from before the revolution's success who were hostile to the Chinese Communist Party. And indeed, they were right about that. There's no disputing that. These campaigns were thorough. They were often brutal. They often resulted in the torture and death of their victims in fairly large numbers. And I don't have any good numbers for you, but I know that they were big. For example, the effort to suppress counter-revolutionaries for the first 3 years of the People's Republic resulted in, I've looked at some records myself, some Chinese police records that were available in flea markets that didn't make it somehow to the document destruction, that got sold into these places and were available. This is the sort of document that Schoenhals used to great effect when he researched his book Spying for the People. And it's the sort of thing I was able to find when I was doing my own research a number of years ago. And they would show, for example, a police record on a particular man in Beijing who used to have a big mouth. He used to say that the Kuomintang are going to come back, and the commies won't last long. And so you better be careful how much you commit yourself to this new government, because who knows what's coming tomorrow. Well, of course, if you're a spy, that's the last thing you're going to do. But if you're an idiot, it might be the first thing you're going to do. And this campaign rounded up a lot of idiots. It did also round up a number of spies, and by the way, this particular man I'm remembering was put into prison for 2 years and then executed. There was another case where a man had been a former Kuomintang military official. He was accused of murder, and he was immediately executed. There are probably some interesting patterns there. I haven't tried to study them, and actually I'm trying to understand them by reading this book by Schoenhals, where he dug into this sort of thing to a much deeper level. But anyway, the campaign got rid of a lot of idiots, but the most important thing it did, in terms of the historical narrative anyway, was that it made it extremely difficult for anybody to even think about opposing the regime, and it also made it difficult, as a side note, for foreign or Taiwan spy agencies to try to recruit and run any networks in China. Those were cleaned up pretty quick, if you want to know the truth. These other campaigns were also quite important. They resulted in finding not only people who were hostile to the regime, but people who were inconvenient to the regime. People who were corrupt, people who were wasteful, people who were leaking state economic information, and by the way, during this period, practically everything that could tell you anything about society or the economy became classified. There were voluminous regulations that were issued during this period, which made simple production statistics classified information, made them secret, that made population figures secret. All sorts of things that we take for granted as being open information, even before the age of the internet in the West, were considered classified information in China. The party also made a special effort to go after religious people. And they did this by closing places of worship, such as churches, by kicking out foreigners who were there as missionaries, and some of them stayed until about 1951. Once the Korean War got started, then it was all over. They were pretty much on their way out, particularly once China intervened, of course. And ordinary lay people who were adherents to religions were required to renounce their beliefs. The same sort of thing that's happening today with the Falun Gong movement in China, where if somebody is found to be a Falun Gong adherent, they're dragged into the police station, told, sign here, this is your confession and your renunciation of the beliefs of this evil cult, and if you refuse to sign it, then off you go to a labor camp, and they'll beat the hell out of you on your way, just for good measure. Or they might kill you, put you in a cell for 5 days without food or water in the middle of winter, that sort of thing. So a lot of these methods survive to this day. And the reason that they were implemented is that, as Mao said, and this is the sort of thing you should use as a quote, by the way, in your papers. Use something original from the period, and I got this straight out of Meisner, that our past work is only the first step in a long march of 10,000 li. In other words, everything we've done up until now to get into power is only the beginning. We have a lot more work to do, which now translated into the idea of continuous revolution. We'll continue the next recording on... No, we won't continue the next recording. We'll try to finish it because this is the last slide for part 1. Okay. So then came a different stage in the campaigns. In 1955, there was another sort of purge campaign, but this one was aimed at people, instead of being aimed at society at large, this one was aimed at people inside of the party. This Sufan, or rectification campaign, had a similar name to one that happened in the 1930s, and the idea was to find traitors in the government and the military, if not the party. With a 10% target at every level that administrators were given to rectify or purge people, this meant that anybody with any problem at all became a suspect and would be struggled against. So I think that much is clear. And then I'm jumping ahead a little bit into 1956, but I think it's important to note this at this point. Then came the revolt in Hungary. That's the country in Eastern Europe. So the revolt in Hungary against Russian rule brought some self-examination at the top levels of the Chinese Communist Party and prompted, for one reason or the other, there are two basic possibilities, prompted Mao Zedong to ask for criticism especially from intellectuals in the party and in the government. His slogan, "Let 100 flowers bloom," and and I think it's 1,000, not 100, schools of thought contend, was meant to bring people to criticize things they knew about that weren't working well so that the party could fix them. However, the avalanche of criticism that resulted was unexpected and led to a backlash, which we'll discuss next time, the anti-rightist campaign of 1957, and it ultimately led to the radicalization by Mao of the political process. There's a continuing debate about the 100 Flowers campaign. Was it a clever ruse to smoke the snakes out of their holes, as Mao said at one point afterwards, or was it a surprise and Mao is just offended and pissed off, and that's why he did what he did in the anti-rightist campaign and in subsequent years. In any case, we'll go on to part 2 in the next recording.